All right. The final warning didn't arrive through diplomatic channels. It didn't arrive through the kind of carefully structured back channel communication that sophisticated political operations use when they want to send a message without creating a record of having sent it. It didn't arrive with the professional courtesy of advance notice, a phone call to the right person at the right level, a quiet conversation in a hallway that doesn't appear on any calendar and doesn't generate any documentation that oversight mechanisms can subsequently locate and read.
It arrived the way final warnings arrive, when the people issuing them have exhausted every prior option and made a deliberate institutional decision that the time for quiet signals has passed. Formally, on the record, through channels whose entire institutional purpose is to ensure that what moves through them cannot subsequently be characterized as ambiguous, misinterpreted,
or subject to the kind of revisionist reading that political operations deploy when they need to claim they weren't warned about something they were warned about completely. The Trump camp received a final warning this week. What that warning actually says, not what the public framing of the panic surrounding it is describing, not what the communications operation deployed to manage the optics of the panic is claiming, but what the warning actually says in the specific institutional language that people with authority to issue warnings of this type use when they want the record to be unambiguous is the thing that nobody covering the Bondi legal storm this week has walked all the way to the center of. I have been at the center of it since the warning cleared. Here is what it actually says and why the panic it produced inside the Trump camp is the most operationally significant signal this entire crisis has generated. The Bondi legal storm has been building across a documented sequence that the public narrative around this week's final warning has been treating as background rather than as the primary explanatory architecture for why the warning arrived when it arrived, in the form it arrived, through the channels it arrived through. That treatment is wrong. The sequence is not background. The sequence is the story. And the sequence has to be traced completely before the final warnings wait. The specific institutional gravity that makes it a last chance rather than another development in an ongoing dispute can be accurately understood. The legal storm didn't begin with a single decision or a single document or a single moment of institutional friction between the political leadership at Main Justice and the professional infrastructure that the political leadership has been attempting to direct toward outcomes that professional infrastructure's own operational logic resists. It began with an accumulation, a slow, documented, institutionally consequential accumulation of moments in which the gap between what the political direction required and what the professional standards permitted produced a recorded disagreement, and then another recorded disagreement, and then another, each one added to a file that was growing in ways that the political operation was monitoring but not accurately assessing in terms of what the growth itself meant for the trajectory they were on. Accumulations have thresholds. Every practitioner who has spent significant professional time inside the accountability mechanisms of the federal government understands that accumulations of institutional disagreement operate like pressure systems. They build quietly. They build behind closed doors. They build in the documented channels that institutions create for professional disagreement to be recorded without immediately becoming a public crisis. And then they reach a threshold where the pressure the accumulation has generated exceeds the capacity of the closed channels to contain it. And the containment fails. And what was a documented internal tension becomes an external institutional event with the momentum that the political operation no longer controls. The final warning is the signal that the threshold has been crossed, not approached, crossed. And the crossing is what the Trump camp's panic is actually responding to. The legal storm has three distinct pressure systems operating simultaneously, and the final warning that arrived this week is the product of all three reaching critical pressure at the same moment rather than sequentially. That simultaneity is what makes this moment categorically different from every prior phase of the Bondi crisis and what makes the final warning something that practitioners with relevant institutional experience read.
as a genuine last chance rather than as another escalation in a managed institutional dispute. The first pressure system is the prosecutorial integrity question. This is a pressure system with the deepest institutional roots and the most durable evidentiary foundation because it is built not on political argument or partisan characterization, but on the documented professional record of specific decisions made by specific people in specific institutional contexts where the standards that govern prosecutorial conduct are both well-established and
non-negotiable in the ways that matter when those standards become the subject of formal accountability inquiry. The prosecutorial integrity question has a specific shape inside the current Bondi legal storm. It is not a general allegation that political considerations have influenced prosecutorial decisions in the broad way that critics of every Justice Department in modern history have alleged at some point during every administration that has occupied main justice. It is a specific documented evidentiary record-supported question about identifiable decisions made during an identifiable period by identifiable decision-makers whose communications records show a documented relationship between political, direction received from above, and professional outcomes produced below that. The standards governing prosecutorial conduct were specifically designed to prevent specific, documented, evidentiary record supported questions are the category of institutional question that formal accountability mechanisms are built to answer. They are not answerable through communications operations. They are not resolvable through political framing. They require legal responses built on the actual record. And the actual record is what the final warning is telling the Trump camp it needs to engage with directly and immediately, because the window for engaging with it on terms that include any meaningful influence over the outcome is closing. The second pressure system is the congressional document exposure. And this is the pressure system that is operating on the fastest external timeline with the least amount of remaining space between where the inquiry tracks are now and where they are heading with or without the Trump camp's cooperation or resistance. The document requests that have been building across the three simultaneous oversight tracks I described previously have reached a stage of specificity that changes their operational character entirely. Early-stage document requests in congressional oversight inquiries are often broad. They are designed to define the scope of available evidence, to understand the documentary landscape of the institutional conduct under review, to identify the specific files and communications records and decision-making trails that the subsequent, more targeted requests will pursue. Broad requests are manageable.
They generate legal arguments about scope and privilege and relevance that can be litigated across timelines that give the target of the inquiry significant ability to shape what actually gets produced and when. The requests that arrived this week are not broad. They are specific in a way that narrow requests become specific only after the committee staff building them have received sufficient sourcing to identify with precision exactly which documents exist, exactly where they exist in the institutional record,
and exactly what they contain in terms sufficient to construct document requests that cannot be deflected through the scope and relevance arguments that broad requests leave available. Narrow, specific document requests built on source knowledge of the documentary record's actual contents are the product of committee staff that is done. The investigative work required to close off the procedural escape routes that the target of an inquiry would otherwise use to delay or limit. Production. The Trump camp's legal team has read the specificity of this week's requests. The reading produced the panic, because specificity at this level means the committee staff already knows what's in the documents they're requesting. The requests are not fishing. The requests are harvesting. And the difference between fishing and harvesting in a congressional oversight context is the difference between an inquiry that the target can shape and an inquiry that the target can only respond to. The final warning is telling the Trump camp that the harvesting has begun. Last chance means the window for cooperation on terms that include any negotiating leverage over what the harvest produces closes before the next phase of the inquiry timeline runs. The third pressure system is the one that the public framing of this crisis has been most systematically avoiding because it involves institutional actors whose standing and authority and professional mandate put them outside the political operation's ability to characterize them in the ways that the operation has successfully characterized prior institutional threats. The Inspector General inquiry that I referenced in the prior analysis of this crisis has developed in ways that the political operations intelligence about its scope and trajectory failed to accurately anticipate. The development is specific. The IG's office has moved from the preliminary investigative phase, the phase where the inquiry is defining its scope, identifying the relevant documentary record, and building the evidentiary foundation for formal findings, into the formal investigative phase. That transition is marked by a specific procedural event, the issuance of formal investigative notifications to the individuals whose conduct the inquiry is examining. Those notifications went out. That is what the final warning is built around at its deepest structural level, because formal IG investigative notifications are not political documents. They are not partisan attacks. They are not oversight mechanisms deployed as weapons by institutional adversaries with political motivations that can be characterized and dismissed through the standard framework the Trump operation applies to congressional inquiries. They are professional accountability instruments issued by an institutional officer whose mandate is specifically designed to be insulated from political direction, whose findings carry institutional weight that transcends the political environment in which they are produced, and whose formal investigative process generates a record that federal law protects from the kind of interference that the political operation has available to it in other institutional contexts. The IG notifications are the final warnings foundation. Everything else in the current crisis, the congressional document requests, the prosecutorial integrity questions, the personnel exposure, sits on top of that foundation. And the foundation is built from material that the political operation doesn't control, cannot alter, and cannot characterize its way around. That is what panic looks like when it has a legitimate institutional basis. 6 voices with operational and technical authority on what the final warning means and where the last chance trajectory leads if the Trump camp fails to accurately assess what it is actually dealing with. A former deputy attorney general who served in a prior Republican administration and has maintained professional relationships with career officials inside the current department.
The issuance of formal IG investigative notifications is the moment that changes the operational calculus of everyone in proximity to the conduct being investigated. Before formal notifications, the institutional dynamic is fluid. People are assessing their exposure, consulting counsel, making judgments about cooperation and non-cooperation on the basis of incomplete information about what the inquiry has and where it is heading.
After formal notifications, the dynamic crystallizes. Everyone knows the inquiry is real, is formal, is on a timeline that the institution controls, and will produce findings that become part of the permanent institutional record, regardless of what the political environment looks like when the findings are released. The crystallization changes behavior in ways that create their own momentum.
And the momentum that formal IG notifications generate is not momentum that a political operations communication strategy reaches. A senior congressional oversight attorney with experience on both majority and minority committee staffs across 3 decades of institutional accountability work.
The specificity of this week's document requests tells me something very specific about the state of the committee staff's documentary knowledge. You don't write requests at this level of specificity without knowing what you're asking for.
The sourcing that produced the knowledge that produces specificity is the most important variable in the current oversight trajectory, because it means the inquiry has already internalized enough of the evidentiary record to make the remaining documentary production confirmatory rather than revelatory. What the production confirms is already understood by the staff that wrote the requests.
The Trump camp's legal team needs to understand that distinction clearly. Producing documents that confirm what the committee already knows is a different institutional situation than producing documents that reveal what the committee doesn't know. The final warning is telling them they're in the confirmation situation, and confirmation situations have a specific set of strategic options that are considerably narrower than the options available earlier in the inquiry trajectory.
A white-collar criminal defense attorney whose practice focuses on federal institutional accountability matters involving executive branch officials. The legal exposure that the current configuration creates for individuals in proximity to the documented conduct under review is not uniformly distributed. There are people inside this situation whose exposure is significantly greater than the public framing of the crisis is representing, and there are people whose exposure is significantly less. The final warning creates different strategic imperatives for people in different exposure positions. For those with significant exposure, the last chance window is a genuine decision point about cooperation with the formal accountability mechanisms that are now running on timelines those individuals don't control. For those with lesser exposure, it is a moment to ensure that the legal architecture around their documented conduct is built before the inquiry reaches them rather than after.
The panic inside the Trump camp is partly a reflection of the fact that the exposure mapping exercise, figuring out who is where on that distribution, has produced results that the political operation didn't anticipate and isn't fully prepared to manage. A former federal prosecutor with experience in cases where institutional conduct at executive branch agencies became the subject of formal criminal referrals from IG investigations.
IG investigations at the formal stage, I understand the current inquiry to have a statutory referral pathway to the Department of Justice. The specific institutional irony of the current situation, an IG investigation into the conduct of the Justice Department's political leadership that would be referred to the Justice Department itself for prosecutorial consideration, creates a structural complexity that the legal team surrounding the Bondi operation needs to be planning for explicitly. Referrals that create structural conflicts of the type that the current configuration would generate have established mechanisms for resolution that route the referral away from the conflicted institution. Those mechanisms exist precisely because institutional conflicts of this type are not hypothetical. They have happened before. They have produced outcomes that the political operations involved did not anticipate.
The final warning is partly a signal that the pathway to those mechanisms is shorter than the Trump camp currently understands it to be. A political crisis management professional whose practice has involved representing senior government officials in institutional accountability proceedings across multiple administrations.
The panic that the final warning has produced inside the Trump camp is operationally significant as a signal beyond its content. Political operations of this experience level and this institutional sophistication don't panic at developments they have accurately assessed and prepared for. Panic is the operational response to the discovery that the assessment was wrong and the preparation was built on the wrong assessment. The specific form the panic is taking, the internal communications breakdown, the legal team emergency sessions, the communications blackout across channels that have been actively managed until this week, is the form that panic takes when the gap between what the operation thought it was dealing with and what the final warning reveals it is actually dealing with is large enough to require.
Rebuilding the entire strategic architecture from the foundation rather than adjusting at the margins. A former Senate Judiciary Committee staff director with specific experience managing oversight inquiries that reach the formal IG notification stage.
There is a moment in every institutional accountability crisis of this type when the trajectory becomes self-reinforcing in ways that the political operation can no longer significantly influence. I believe that moment has arrived in the current Bondi legal storm. The self-reinforcing dynamic is driven by the interaction between the three simultaneous oversight tracks, and the formal IG process. Each track is generating information that feeds the others. The IG notifications are producing behavioral responses inside the institution that generate new documentary evidence for the congressional inquiries. The congressional inquiries are producing documentary requests whose specificity signals to IG investigators what the committee staff already knows, which calibrates the IG investigation's focus toward the evidentiary territory the committee sourcing has identified. The political operation is not a participant in that self-reinforcing dynamic. It is the subject of it. And being the subject of a self-reinforcing institutional accountability dynamic that has reached the formal stage is a specific situation that final warnings are issued to describe. Here's precisely where the last chance stands in real operational terms, as the Trump camp processes a panic that its communications operation is trying to manage publicly while its legal team tries to assess privately whether the window the final warning describes has enough time left. In it to matter, the last chance is real. It is not a political characterization deployed to create urgency that serves someone's narrative interest. It is a genuine description of a specific institutional window that the formal IG notification timeline and the congressional document request calendar have created simultaneously, and that will close on those timelines regardless of what the political operations response to the final warning looks like. What the last chance actually offers is narrow. It does not offer the opportunity to prevent the formal accountability process from reaching conclusions. That process is running. Its institutional momentum is not interruptible at this stage through anything the political operation can credibly execute. It does not offer the opportunity to shape the documentary record that the inquiry tracks are building toward. Because the documentary record exists in institutional repositories, that the political operations influence over document preservation and production is legally constrained in ways that matter more now than they did at any prior stage of this crisis. What the last chance offers is the opportunity to engage the formal accountability mechanisms on terms that include some measure of institutional good faith, before the mechanism's own findings define the terms of engagement for every subsequent phase. Institutional good faith in formal accountability proceedings is not a political concept. It is a practical one. It affects the character of formal findings. It affects the institutional relationship between the subjects of accountability proceedings and the mechanisms conducting them. It affects the downstream legal and institutional consequences of those findings in ways that the political framing of this crisis will not be able to reshape once the findings are in the permanent record. The Trump camp has until the window the final warning describes closes to decide whether the last chance is a genuine strategic option or a political concession that the operation's identity won't permit it to take. That decision is being made right now in legal consultations and strategic sessions that don't appear on any public schedule and don't generate any public record. The Bondi legal storm is not a weather event that passes when the political environment shifts.
It is a documented institutional crisis with formal accountability mechanisms running on independent timelines, building toward formal findings that will exist in the permanent institutional record, regardless of what the political environment looks like when they are released, regardless of what the communications operations on every side of this crisis claim those findings mean, and regardless of whether the public framing of the final warning accurately represents what the warning actually says or retreats into the partisan characterizations that make the story legible to political audiences while making the actual institutional stakes invisible.
The final warning is in the record. The IG notifications are in the record. The congressional document requests with their revelatory specificity are in the record. The panic inside the Trump camp is visible to every institutional actor whose cooperation or non-cooperation the next phase of this crisis turns on.
And the window the final warning describes is closing on a timeline that the formal accountability mechanisms control. Last chances are called last chances because they are last, not second to last, not latest in a continuing sequence. Last, the institutional architecture of what is running toward the Bondi operation right now does not produce another warning after this one. It produces findings, It produces referrals. It produces formal records that the permanent institutional history of this Justice Department will be organized around regardless of what happens to the political operation that appointed its current leadership. The storm is not breaking. It is making landfall. Stay in this, subscribe, notifications on. Because the moment the Trump camp's response to the final warning becomes visible in the institutional record through cooperation or resistance, through legal engagement or political deflection, through the choices that Last Chance's force, is the moment that defines whether this crisis ends as a managed institutional reckoning or as something that the political operation surrounding it is still explaining years from now. The warning has been issued. The window is open. It will not stay open. I'll be here when it closes.